Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Royal Society of Arts and to this event, which is called Work Less and Get Things Done. I'm Robert Booth. I'm the social affairs correspondent at The Guardian newspaper. I've written a bit about 4-Day Week, and hence I've been invited to chair this session today, which is linking the publication of a new book called Shorter, How Working Less Will Revolutionize the Way Your Company Gets Things Done. And also probably how you can get things done in a different way. And it's written by Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, who's here today, and he's going to speak to us for 10 minutes about that. He's here on my left. What he's looking at is essentially, what we're looking at as a group is looking at whether it is time to redesign the working week. There's a lot of talk about this in the media at the moment, in politics as well. And the book Shorter delves into the global movement. Alex has been around the world looking at different examples of how companies in all sorts of different industries have been moving to 4-day weeks or 6-hour days or other forms of kind of compressed working in an attempt to improve productivity and possibly profitability as well. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Phones, if we could just make sure we've switched those off. We are filming today's event and live streaming it over the web, so welcome to anyone watching online in their lunch break perhaps. And a reminder, if you're interested in tweeting or getting involved on that platform, we're using the hashtag RSA Short Week, hashtag RSA Short Week. Finally, there's going to be a rather unscientific poll which we're going to be running here and online about whether you think a 4-day week is a good idea or not. And one of our speakers here is having to argue kind of against a 4-day week, and he's not hopeful. Anyway, I think the details of that will be up on the screen later, and you can take part in that. So let me just say a brief word about the people that we're going to be hearing from today. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, is based in the future, i.e. Menlo Park in Silicon Valley. He is a futurist. Essentially, he has worked in technology forecasting for all sorts of different companies. He spent 2 decades studying the interface between people and technology, and he's worked with all sorts of governments and large companies and spoken around the world. He also wrote a book, interestingly, recently about rest and why you get more done when you work less. So you can see that he's interested in the interface between what we do at work, how we do it, and the kind of productivity, which is a lot of the argument about the 4-day week. Then next we're going to hear from Julian Jessup, who's in the middle here. He's an independent economist. He's from the UK. He has worked at the Treasury, which is, we could probably ask him about that for most of the session, and also HSBC in the City, and he is a fellow of the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. And we are going to hear from him. And finally, we're going to hear from FRANCKE, furthest left here, and she is currently the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute. I don't know, you're not going to be the Chief, anyway, you are the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, previously a Senior Executive at companies like Procter & Gamble and Mars. She's an expert on gender balance in the workplace, and she speaks frequently in the media and at conferences on that and other management topics, and so we will hear from her. She's the author of a book called Create a Gender Balanced Workplace. Where's your copy? Ah, there you go. Anyway, it's got a lovely cover. It's got a lovely... Penguin. Please join us in welcoming our panel. I think first it's you, Alex.
All right.
Please.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah. So thanks very much for coming out on your lunch hour. It is, I suppose, obligatory when you're talking about the 4-day week at some point to invoke John Maynard Keynes and Bertrand Russell's essays from about 90 years ago. So I will start there and get that out of the way. I normally, I think as most of us know, they talked in economic prospects of our grandchildren and in praise of idleness, about how by now our generation could be working 15 or 20 hours a week. And usually the next sentence after that is either sort of what went wrong with the world or what did they get wrong. But I think I want to go in another direction in this, which is in the conclusion of In Praise of Idleness, Bertrand Russell has this line that has always stuck with me. And he said, "Modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all. We have chosen instead to have overwork for some and starvation for the others," which seems to me like not a bad description of a kind of polarized labor and work environment that sort of exists now. But Russell actually was actually right on both counts. Where he gets wrong is suggesting that this was an either-or proposition. Because information technologies, mobile devices, and most recently robotics and artificial intelligence have dramatically improved our productivity and given us the possibility of ease and security for all. The problem is that a combination of toxic culture, outmoded thinking, poor management, malign product design, and bad economics have buried those gains under a world that creates overwork for some and starvation for others. So to put it another way, the 4-day week is actually already here. It's just covered over by bad practices and habits. And in my new book, Shorter, I talk about companies all over the world in fast-paced, highly competitive industries, software, design, advertising, restaurants, financial services, and others, that are figuring out how to strip away those layers of unproductive practice and thinking, moving to 4-day weeks without cutting salaries, without sacrificing productivity or profitability, or alienating customers or clients. Now, leaders of the companies making this jump are trying to solve actually pretty immediate, familiar business challenges. They want to recruit and retain great people, which for software companies and restaurants and such is actually a real serious problem these days. Leaders and their employees are struggling with work-life balance. Most of the founders are veterans of places like Google or McKinsey or Kantar and are now parents of young children. They want to have space to think creatively and to be more innovative. And they want to build more sustainable companies that don't burn themselves and employees out, but help them do work that they all really enjoy. So how do they do this? Well, studies find that in offices, most of us lose about 2 hours of productive time per day to multitasking, meetings, interruptions, and other things. So if you can deal with that, you're a long way to being able to do 5 days work in 4. So companies often start by shortening meetings, reducing the number of meetings they hold, and they encourage better use of existing technologies and encourage people to experiment with new tools that help them be more productive and more focused. And they redesign the workday itself, setting aside periods during which people can work undisturbed on their most important tasks and reserving other times for meeting clients, for brainstorming, for lunches, and so on. And in other industries, it works a little bit differently, but it still works. So government agencies, factories, repair shops may adopt 6-hour shifts, but they lengthen the time that they're open, which turns out to be a win for customers as well as benefiting workers. And even in hourly work, higher spending on salaries can be offset by savings elsewhere. So in the United States, there are several nursing homes that have created programs for certified nursing assistants, who are the people who actually spend a lot of time with residents. They help them get dressed, they bathe them, they spend time with them throughout the day. And some nursing homes now offer 40 hours pay for 30 hours work, assuming workers hit certain benchmarks. And at one nursing home, the program cost an extra $140,000 per year, but the net cost was actually only $20,000 because they saved so much money on temp agency fees, recruitment, advertisers, and other things. And the quality of care was also dramatically higher. So moving to a 4-day week isn't just about cutting salaries or cutting hours. It's about figuring out how to work fewer hours while maintaining same levels of productivity, profitability, quality, and creativity. So how well do companies do in meeting these objectives? Well, the 4-day week helps solve significant problems with recruitment and retention, work-life balance, professional development, and sustainability. People say that they're happier and healthier, both at work and at home. They have more time for hobbies, for spending time with family and children. None of this is surprising. But it also benefits companies as well. Almost all of them report higher revenues and profits despite the drop in work time. And companies fighting for talent can get more senior people who've done their share of late nights and want to keep doing great work, but in a saner kind of environment. Retention rates go up, which for small startups or little companies can be huge. You know, losing a key developer or a senior marketing person at the wrong moment can be really an existential problem. It also benefits company culture. It's the challenge of figuring out how to do 5 days work in 4 encourages people to be more experimental, to have more of a growth mindset. And immediately getting the benefits of streamlining your processes, harnessing new tools, provides a powerful incentive to master new technologies. And for older professionals, it's a chance to put their experience to use fixing what's broken in their professions, what they've always hoped to be able to repair. And customers turn out to be supportive rather than resistant. Business clients, it turns out, have the same kinds of problems with recruitment and work-life balance and so on. And so companies trialing 4-day weeks are kind of working on solutions that might actually help them as well. And the shorter work week also changes the way that companies hire and who they look for. As one founder put it, anyone can sit in a chair for 12 hours a day. What you really want in a shorter work week is people who are experienced enough to successfully redesign their work, who have strong organizational skills, who know how to both collaborate and ruthlessly prioritize, and maybe are a little underappreciated in their current jobs. So one of the things that happens in these environments is that working mothers who around the world still have to fight to maintain the same responsibilities that they have before becoming parents in conventional companies turn out to be able to turn out not to suffer a penalty for motherhood, but are able to charge a premium for it. Finally, a more widespread adoption of the 4-day week could benefit countries as well. Shorter working hours translate into lower energy consumption, less carbon, less commuting time. And it could also benefit regions and countries trying to become magnets for global talent or to attract young people back home. And an economy in which workers have a bigger voice in how work is automated and get a bigger share of the benefits of increased productivity is one in which we're less likely to suffer huge disruptions from automation and AI. So we take for granted that long hours are the norm, that they are inevitable and unavoidable, and that overwork is a fact of life, and that burnout is an occupational hazard. We celebrate our ability to succeed in a world that offers overwork for some, but it turns out that now, right now, today, we have the means to create ease and security for all. It's just a question of recognizing that that future is within our grasp and taking advantage of it. Thank you very much.
I knew that would happen. Right, thank you. I feel like I've drawn the short straw today. What sort of wretch is going to stand in front of you and argue against a shorter working week? Let me start then with sort of 3 positive points of agreement. First, I think there's a lot of agreement that people working fewer hours tend to be happier and more productive, meaning that their output per hour increases. Certainly nobody wants burned out workers. No employer would think that's a good idea. Second, there are clearly lots of important social gains that you can make from flexible working. So, for example, parents in particular may benefit from more family-friendly hours. And third, it's worth saying that at various points in history, government intervention has definitely helped to improve working conditions. So in the case of the UK, for example, I'm thinking of the Factory Acts in the 19th century. So given those positive points, what is my problem? Basically, I've got concerns about the feasibility of everybody working shorter hours and the potential costs in terms of lost income, lost production and flexibility, as well as potentially increases in costs for some businesses that aren't able to handle these problems. Here I've actually got 4 points to make, so these are my 4 negative points outweighing my 3 positive ones. First, it's simply not enough to say that people working fewer hours are more productive. They actually have to be a lot more productive if they're going to want to still take home the same pay at the end of the week for what they do. Suppose, for example, you work 4 days rather than 5. In order to do the same amount of work in that shorter time period, you actually have to increase your hourly output by 25%. Now, that might be possible in some businesses, and I know Alex has lots of good examples, primarily from tech industries and from creative industries. But it's very hard to achieve that across the economy as a whole. And it's a particular problem in service sectors where people are basically spending their time dealing face-to-face with other people. If you take the example of a GP whose diary is already full of 10-minute appointments with patients, it's very hard for them to increase the number of patients that they see in a day by 25%. Similarly, it's very hard for a surgeon to perform 25% more operations in a given period. So the imposition of a shorter working week will be a particular problem for the NHS, and this is something that you may remember during the election campaign when Labour was promoting a shorter working week. It didn't really have a good answer to this question. Many more people would end up having to be employed in those health service roles at substantial cost potentially to the taxpayer. But I think it's a problem for many other sectors too. So someone working as a teacher or a driver or a hairdresser is going to find it very difficult to do an awful lot more work in a shorter period of time. My second point is, well, first let's step back and suppose it is possible for someone to work fewer hours and be significantly more productive, so that they're worth at least as much to their current employer. Why on earth then is this not already happening? Why does the government need to get involved to tackle that problem? Now, I know we're supposed to believe that bosses are all evil capitalist scum looking to exploit their workforce, but are we also supposed to believe that they're so stupid that they can't recognize things in front of them that might actually make them even bigger profits? Now, that may well be the case in some companies. I mean, clearly there are cultural problems and old habits that need to die. And then people like Alex can promote those cultural changes. But I don't see an obvious role for the government in particular to wade in and intervene. Third, if you look at the precedents where there has been heavy intervention by the government, they're not actually very encouraging. I think almost everybody agrees that the imposition of a one-size-fits-all 35-hour week in France ended up doing more harm than good. Even the report on working hours that John McDonnell commissioned from the economist Lord Skidelsky last year was quite cautious on what could be achieved here in practice. And above all, I think there's a frequent tension in policy circles between calls for more government intervention on the one hand and attacks on forms of flexible employment on the other, even when those new forms of employment might actually be precisely the way that some people could end up working shorter hours if they want to. For instance, some would like to see a much bigger role for trade unions and for collective bargaining in governing hours as well as pay. But again, that could be a dangerous form of one-size-fits-all policy. My own favourite example here, and I know this one is controversial, is calls to ban so-called zero-hours contracts, which are contracts that don't guarantee a fixed number of hours worked per week. Now, obviously, there is a trade-off between flexibility and security, and sometimes that doesn't work out the best way. But many people actually like the opportunities that zero-hours contracts provide, and there may be one way for some people to work shorter hours if indeed they want to do so. Now, to be fair, Skidelsky conceded that his proposals could be criticised on the grounds that, and I'm going to quote from his report here, they set up bureaucratic and collective mechanisms for achieving outcomes which should be left to the market. Actually, it's very much my point, quite so. One of the great strengths of a flexible labour market is that most people can choose jobs, hours and patterns of work that suit their personal circumstances, and that clearly is something that can be encouraged. So in summary, I do think that a better work-life balance is a good thing. But people also do still need to earn money. The economy has to generate the income and the output that can then be used to finance the public services on which we all rely. Governments in particular, I think, need to tread carefully here. A tax on flexible forms of employment won't help deliver the productivity gains that we need in order to improve real wages and allow those people who want to work less. So above all, it's important to recognise that there are trade-offs here between shorter hours and other things that you might value. And sometimes those trade-offs are not actually favourable. Thank you.
Right, well, I think we've heard from both Alex and Julian some very, very good and compelling arguments around this topic. I'm going to cover this position from three somewhat different points, but I'll try and relate back to theirs. The first is, and this won't surprise any of you in the room, that CMI, we have about 130,000 members. All of them are either aspiring or practicing managers, and we asked them about this not long ago. It was actually in November 2018. And there will be no prizes for how that went. The vast majority of the just over 1,000 managers that responded to our survey were very much in favor of a 4-day work week. Now you might say, well, why were they in favor? And again, I think you've heard from Alex many of the reasons why they thought this was a very good idea. They felt it would dramatically improve job satisfaction, and we do know that more engaged employees are more productive. And on average, we see at CMI that when you have engaged employees, your productivity can increase by up to 32%. So clearly, managers see engaged employees as a positive. But the other benefits, again, Alex has alluded to them, were in the recruitment and retention of talent, where they felt that actually this would make their job recruiting better people and keeping them a much easier task, and actually in the productivity gains and in the quality of work gains that they felt they would experience by shorter working hours. And that's quite interesting, and it might seem contradictory, but as we know, the number one driver of productivity is actually the quality of leadership and management. And when you are simply managing people by presenteeism, which is a lot of what long hours culture does, then you're absolutely not managing at all the quality of the work they do. You can sit, as Alex said, in a chair for 12 hours. For all we know, you could be on Facebook, chatting with your friends for 8 of those 12 hours and perhaps tweeting for the rest. It doesn't necessarily equate for getting the output that we need and the quality that we need. And this is particularly true for a knowledge economy like Great Britain, where a lot of our outputs really aren't measured, and I do respect that hairdressers are a little different in this regard, although the quality of the haircut could be important to some of us. But a lot of the quality of the work we do can simply not be measured by the inputs. Even the example of GPs. Many GPs would argue that actually by seeing fewer patients and spending more time with them, they would give better diagnostics that would result in better health outcomes for many of their patients. So managers do see the logic of this, and they do see that it would lead them to be better leaders and managers themselves. My second point, and here's where I actually have quite a lot of sympathy for the point that Julian made, is I do not believe in a one-size-fits-all. I certainly do not believe this should be a government policy or a partisan policy or that it should be legislated. What I would say is that employers that allow their employees to schedule their work around their lives will be rewarded, and there is ample evidence to suggest this. And that may be through a 4-day work week. It may be through allowing flexible work on any given day across a week. It may be through a job share, but it's allowing people to fit their work around their lives. When I was at Procter & Gamble, one of my favorite anecdotes is I was a divorced mother. I had to take my kid to school. I was in a custody suit. So I just told my manager, non-negotiable, I'm going to be late for your meeting that starts at 9 a.m. every day. He said, fine. So I paid that forward. I had one guy that liked to play in an orchestra. He left early for practice. I had another woman that played netball. I had a third guy that liked to come in late and stay late because he liked to go out clubbing. Didn't matter. They all worked around their lives. Do you know that we had the highest shares and margins on our brand anywhere in the world, and we got a visit from HQ in Cincinnati, it was Procter & Gamble, to figure out what that was. It was allowing people to fit their work around their lives. So that is a leading prescription, and if you can do that with shorter hours, well, why wouldn't you? You'll be better bosses, you'll have a happier workforce. And my final point in all of this is really what I'm getting at, which we know drives the most productive outcomes, the best mental health and well-being, and the best results for everybody, including inclusive workforces. And that's that we are inclusive managers and leaders. And actually allowing people to fit their work around their lives, whatever their reason is, whether it's a triathlon, children, or caring for a sick parent, just results in a better, more productive, happier outcome, not only for the individuals and teams, but for their organizations and for society as a whole. And for this reason, I think it's something that we should do today.
Thank you, Anne. That was great. So what we'll do now is we'll have a little chat here as a group, and then we'll open it up to questions in a few minutes' time. I was struck by I suppose the idea that this is something that could help everybody in society. And I was wondering a little bit as I was hearing the contributions, if there's a sort of social justice question actually in this, because in the UK, actually, hours have been getting longer. And I think it was 2014 was the first time since the Second World War when average working hours started to get longer again. So there's we're sort of pushing against the momentum of the economy. And what you guys were talking about there was a sort of group of people for whom this might work quite well, whether it's managers in Procter & Gamble, or if it's people who are capable of reimagining their own work and being creative with that. And it's not about the Uber driver or the Deliveroo courier or that other part of the economy that seems to be growing. So I just wonder if there's any sense in which this is just for a particular cadre of people, or actually if it's something that could work across the bulk of the UK economy.
Well, I think it's certain, Uber drivers are people who are in, or of these kinds of sort of precarious jobs, have a lot of things stacked against them already. And I think it is a challenge if you are some sort of hourly or piece worker, whether that is, whether it's an Uber driver or a lawyer, or to shorten hours this way. Plenty of law firms or accountancies go from charging hourly to project-based work before they go to 4-day work weeks. So as a way of eliminating that. So I think I think as a broader question though of, is it the case, is there a social justice argument to be made for those people who have less choice about the long hours that they work? Yeah, I think there is, and I think it's one that's not difficult to make. It's one to be made alongside, though, I think the economic case for the benefits to organizations and to society at large for shortening working hours.
But aren't they least likely to get the benefits, those people?
Yeah, I mean,
because they can't move on to 4-day weeks.
There's a category of people for whom either moving themselves to 4-day weeks, or being moved without fundamentally re-engineering their jobs is going to be incredibly hard. These are people who, but you can add this to the stack of problems that that such jobs bring.
Yeah.
But Alex, you gave us an example of nursing home care workers, right? Now these are they're low-skilled hourly wage workers. You gave us an example of a nursing home that reduced their work week, but measured the outputs in care. And so I would submit that if you go to a system where instead of measuring the input, which is time, you measure the output, whether that's quality of patient care, that's actually what you're talking about. That's how we get a more productive situation. Will that work universally across the board? No. But if you were an Uber driver, I suppose the way you'd game it is you'd say, I'm only going to drive in surge hours. I'm going to get more money when I drive.
That example of the nurses was very grabbing, but wasn't it essentially that they were being paid more per hour, and that's what was increasing their productivity, not that they had Friday off?
They were being paid more per hour if they made certain benchmarks. So, sort of they didn't call in sick. They worked all 6 hours of their shift. Those are really the two major things that they had to do. And yes, so at the end of the week, if you did those things, then you got paid 40 hours work, 40 hours for 30 hours. So it was there was a very clear linkage between sort of working in this way and getting that reward.
Julian, thinking about the structure of the British economy then, what are the big blockages to this coming through?
Well, I think that, to go back to your point, you made a point earlier which I think is interesting about how hours worked has started to increase since about 2014. I think there are lots of things happening here. I mean, partly the economy has been recovering over that period, so there's simply more work opportunities for people to do, so there's a positive story there. There's also a negative story, which is around the weakness of productivity growth in the UK, actually in all major economies, but in the UK more than most. And there is a problem that you have that short-term, hopefully, thing distorting some of the data. So because people are less productive, they're maybe having to work longer. Because companies are reluctant to invest, they're not putting as much money into machinery and equipment and things like that might improve the productivity of individual workers. There's a huge debate about how best to deal with that. My hope and expectation is that this is essentially a temporary phenomenon. It's a legacy of the global financial crisis. Businesses are nervous. They've had the additional uncertainty of Brexit in the UK over the last 3 years as well. Banks are reluctant to lend because they're dealing with the legacy of the bad debts on their books and so on. So hopefully in time this will work through. We're already approaching some form of full employment in the UK. I'm wary of how I put that because I know lots of people are underemployed. They're not necessarily doing the jobs that they want to, but we're starting to see labour shortages in the UK. The unemployment rate is certainly very, very low. So I think that will also further incentivise companies themselves to make the sorts of changes that we're talking about. If recruitment and retention becomes an even bigger problem because there are labour shortages, then they're going to have to work even harder to keep people happy. And if that means shorter hours where people are more productive, then so be it. But throughout this, I think a consistent theme, one of the themes I keep coming back to, is that I don't think the government needs to get involved with this. And I am concerned if the government did get involved, there'd be all sorts of unintended consequences. It would be increased costs for those businesses that maybe can't adapt as quickly, problems in things like the NHS. So I think this is clearly something that a trend that we would hope to see continue and accelerate towards people working shorter and more flexible hours. But I still think the market can drive it without the government needing to be involved.
I think it's probably quite unlikely that any government, after what happened with Labour in the general election, I think it's unlikely that politicians will be interested in getting involved themselves. Because I think Skidelsky's recommendation was that, the government as a client and an employer itself might lead that change. But that's only a small part of the economy, isn't it? And the backlash that there was about the idea that the NHS could go to a 4-day week shows that it's very difficult. You touched on something there about happiness of workers as well, and the fact that we're reaching closer to full employment, and therefore retaining people is going to be more important. I wonder, Anne, in thinking about sort of families and mothers and fathers, how the 4-day week could change the way that a whole working life might pan out.
Yeah, well, one of the inhibitors to productivity, and it's interesting because at one point we talked about, well, we're rational, right? If we knew something would raise GDP, we would do it. Well, gender balance would add 150 billion to the UK economy. That's 5% of GDP, but we still don't do it. One of the things that would drive us being able to do this is to have much more shared parental leave. Currently only 2% of fathers take paternity leave. It falls to the woman. She often gets held back in promotion, as Alex has highlighted. There is the motherhood penalty, which the Treasury, among others, have calculated. And by moving to a 4-day week, which is more flexible and would allow working couples to better plan their child care, you would get more productive organizations. And absolutely, this is something that would aid the economy and get more people back into it. Because, you know, returners, women who have stopped their careers for 10 years, are an incredible loss of productivity. These people are highly educated. Getting them back in with something like this could be also a huge enabler for increased productivity.
Actually, just on the gender point, one of the problems here is that there are habits that die hard, and there's certainly a gender distinction between some of these habits. So, for example, when I worked in the city, if a man left early to go and pick up his children from school, other men would typically say, "Oh, great, he's good for him, you know, he's chipping in," that sort of thing. If a woman wanted to do that, typical woman, you know, this is what happens when you recruit women. Now that is a classic example of a sort of hidden bias. In this case, sometimes it's pretty explicit. And I think similarly, the presenteeism argument is a classic one. Again, in the city, it was a common habit to have an extra jacket that you left on your chair while you were out having your long lunch. And that was clearly a complete waste of time. So I've got absolutely no doubt that there are big cultural changes that you can make. And I think a lot of the work should be done by consultants such as yourself and organisations such as yourself to draw attention to these cultural problems and make people aware that there is a failure here. There's a market failure, which is perhaps a lack of information. People don't understand sometimes that running businesses in these ways are actually bad.
I wonder, Alex, could you talk about the 2 hours that can be gained by not buggering around at work, basically? And yeah. I was really thinking about the faffing about on Twitter and going onto Facebook and going and sort of spending too long at the coffee point. That's all great, but actually isn't that part of being a human being as well, that you need that kind of, that to try and compress the working week is also kind of inhumane?
Yes to the first, no to the second. I mean, I think that sort of one of the really interesting things that you see in the way that work days play out in sort of places that move to 4 days is a kind of rebalancing of social and work time, so that there's less sort of time on Twitter, less just kind of asking people that one question that turns into 15 minutes that distracts you from some critical task. But there's also spontaneous stuff like people making lunch together. Sort of the time when you're social, you are really social. And the reality is, a lot of us go to work partly because we see friends there. And one of the good pieces of news is that that doesn't get completely destroyed. One of my favorite examples of this is a company called Pursuit Marketing in Glasgow. They're a call center. And the first several weeks after they implemented a 4-day week, there were a few people who were coming into the office on Friday for like half an hour and then disappearing. And finally, the managing director asked one of them what's going on, and they fessed up they hadn't told their wives that they were now working 4 days a week. So they were coming in, making a call, and then going off and, hanging out. And that's, it's a lovely illustration of how, social life at work is a significant thing. It actually also helps make us better workers and more productive. But it's also the case, I think people find ways of being social and easing the potential for sort of a kind of inhumane outcome.
Okay, let's throw it open to the room. There's lots of questions here. How do we do this? Are there any microphones? Yes, great. Okay, over here, please, in the middle. Oh yeah, we're going to do, so what we're going to, the poll is up there already. We're starting to vote. Phone lines are open. I'm being told, phone lines are open. Okay, there you go. How do they vote in the room? Through that? I don't know what that means. Visit Slido. Oh, there you go, okay. Sorry, visit slido.com and vote from there. But yes, your question.
Hello, I'm really interested in organisational responsibility for this. So Bain & Co did some research, didn't they, on what they call organisational drag. And they said that we spend, so those of us who are knowledge workers, often on fairly invisible output, a report or whatever it is, we lose about 20% of our week, which is the one lost day right there, on pointless emails, meetings that overrun and ramble and don't have an agenda, calcified processes, duplicated processes. Somebody else starts a project, halfway through someone says, why are we doing this? Because we've got that one going over there, so we start again. Yeah. And they said that people that manage, so they're managing their individual output as well as a team, lose at least a quarter of their time. So I think what we're talking about is, and then there's also the whole layer of work that digitization has given us on top of the real work. So the emails, the social media and all that kind of thing. So I think if managers were better at really getting on top of this stuff, they could track the time it takes to do tasks. They fight against Parkinson's law, the work takes as long as the time available. So we say, look, block out 2 hours to do that, but we don't actually think, do you know what, if we just did that without distraction and we didn't have the opportunity cost of switch tasking, we could get that done in 45 minutes. So I think it actually comes down to management and leadership responsibility for looking at, for knowledge workers, actually how long does the work take? And instead of a lot of pointless, I promise I'll hand this over in a second, but I think instead of a lot of pointless HR initiatives, what HR should really be doing, and leaders of organizations, is saying, do you know what, let's get that work done as quickly as possible. Go home, have a life, re-energize, come back in tomorrow, get your work done as quickly as possible. So I think it's an organizational responsibility, and like anything, it comes down to good management.
Thank you. Good rallying cry. Let's have another point or question. Just pass it across there. Why not? It'll be quicker. Thank you.
I go first very quickly because you'll get it next. Just very quickly, I think this has highlighted what seems to me a really key point, which is there's a difference between 4 days a week structurally and working flexibly, I think. And the idea that people should be encouraged to work as little as they need to get things done. And if that means they go home 2 hours early, or they come in 2 hours late, or they disappear at lunchtime for 3 hours, so long as they're doing what they need to, that seems to me to be a different challenge to trying to create a 4-day week structure where nearly everybody has a Friday off, for example.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It was amazing just listening to all the speakers. Thank you. Mr. Pang, this is a very specific question for you. I do have your book, and I happen to work for a not-for-profit. So I wondered, apart from one not-for-profit that you actually looked at, there isn't actually mention of many not-for-profits within the book itself. And I wondered why that was, unless, of course, there's a generally held view that people who are in not-for-profits don't work at all.
The answer, I found one in Oakland that is so far of the only one I found, mainly because, and I think there is a sense within that world, not that people don't work, but there are a million problems to solve. If you're working in philanthropy or you're doing social justice stuff, when do you how do you justify, stopping making the world a better place? And so that's, and so, the place that I visited at least explained it that way. That they, so I hope that. So yeah.
Sorry, just to pick up on a point the gentleman made there about there have been two separate things here, the shorter hours, or the hours that you work, and the flexibility around them. I'm actually rather keener to argue in favour of more flexibility than I am necessarily in favour of shorter hours. There may well be people who, for whatever reason, want to work long hours. I mean, they might even like their jobs. They might be working in non-profit sectors where they're actually...
very lonely.
They might be very lonely. Exactly. Or they might frankly need the money. That's the other thing, of course. I mean, lots of people may need to work long hours because they need the money. So that's point one. Point two, because I don't think anybody really knows how other companies should be run or how the economy as a whole should work itself out, why not give people as much flexibility as possible and then let them work it out? I mean, this is classic free market
but
stuff,
there
isn't
have
it?
been studies, Ernst & Young has done one, that shows that when you enable flexible working, you do get double-digit productivity boosts, and we've done something similar. So I agree with you that it is about letting people work flexibly rather than legislating a one-size-fits-all solution. I also want to say to the lady who highlighted the impact of bad management, so it too costs the economy $150 billion a year. And that comes from the Bank of England and some work that Charlie Mayfield's done on productivity. And so really, you're absolutely right about upping the management practices. And again, good managers and leaders don't do the unnecessary stuff. They trust people and they focus on outputs, not face time. And we are still some way away from an economy that allows everybody to do that, despite the evidence that it works.
Let's take a couple more questions. Let's go. Can we go over to this side of the room here? This lady in the front row. Thank you.
Hello. This is a question for Alex. I wanted to know a bit more about the how-to around the 4-day week. So I work with lots of people in charities, sort of middle senior managers, and then I also work with entrepreneurs, and they all have very different ways of getting.
It's a very deep question. Right.
So I was interested in how it happens.
Sure. So in the office context as opposed to garages or factories or other places, almost always the first thing that people attack are meetings, right? Meetings are too long, nobody likes meetings, in most places they're pretty poorly disciplined, and also meeting software tends to, years ago, some engineer in Seattle decided meetings would default to being an hour long, and the whole world has just followed this. So by making meetings shorter, making them more pointed, thinking harder about who it is who needs to be in them, often eliminating the standing 9 a.m. meeting every single day, you do a couple things. One is you free up people's time. Another is by attacking this thing that everybody loves to change, you get an early important win. And it begins to raise the question, all right, if we can change this, what else can we change? The next thing people do is focus on technology stuff. So this means, number one, cutting out the distracting stuff, the Slack channel, having people check email at particular times of day, but also giving people the power to experiment with tools, with processes, to figure out what things they themselves can automate and what things they can use technology to allow themselves to kind of climb up the value chain. And then after that, I think redesigning the workday to have clearer boundaries between focus time, time with clients, or brainstorming time, and social time is something I see in a lot of places. And if you can just do those three things, you go an awful long way to being able to reclaim those 2 hours that workers lose and the 25% time that managers lose. And then after that, it becomes really, really incredibly specific depending upon your business and your clients and the rhythm and all that stuff. But just do those three things and you're like in the top 10%.
That's good advice. Let's have another question here.
So I'm just going to be reading some questions from online. So apologies if I get any of the names wrong, but we have Sam asking, how do we manage technology to achieve a work and social balance, which you've kind of just mentioned. And then Lewis, who's asking, what do you think about the message that Andrew Yang talked about, what the market does and does not value, like caretaking, something we didn't include in the GDP?
Well, one thing about the technology that Alex gave a lot of really good answers, but how many people clear their email inbox? Okay, stop.
Why is that a good thing? Why should you do that?
Because a lot of the emails you get are completely and utterly unnecessary. And you shouldn't respond to them because you're just wasting your time and everybody's time that sent you the email. So I think we somehow have this notion that we have to respond to all your emails. You do not. You should look at the email and respond to it if it's important, and if it's not important, don't respond to it, just ignore it. So I think we allow technology sometimes to get in the way through, silly rules like, oh God, I've got to clear my inbox. You do not have to clear your inbox. You also don't have to check your emails at 6 a.m. in the morning, which is another habit we've all fallen into, which is very bad. It's bad for productivity.
But it's beginning to feel like there's loads of different things we should be worrying about before the 4-day week, isn't it? If you're just giving us like tons of homework right there, and we could do this as well, and that would solve it. Let's take another question. Well, anyone.
Hi, thanks. Flexibility and income bring to mind universal basic income, which is a issue that the RSA has been doing a lot of work on. Seems to me these two issues, shorter working week and UBI, kind of dovetail together in some ways. Is there a way in which the campaign for changes in these areas, these two can be brought together?
Julian, I should imagine you love the idea of just giving everyone free money, right?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a tree to produce it in the first place. Yeah. On the UBI question then, I think I'm a fan of the UBI in principle, but in practice it seems to be very hard to design one that will actually deliver the results that you want. In order for it to have a sort of meaningful impact on people's life choices, whether they work shorter hours or go and train or become off-grid hermits, whatever it is they want to be, it has to be set at such a high level that it actually turns out to be very expensive. So there's a sort of dilemma there between setting it at high enough levels to work and actually and therefore imposing a huge cost on everybody else to fund it. It's a difficult one. I certainly think it's an idea worth exploring. I mean, it's been suggested in lots of other contexts. So, for example, a way of redistributing the benefits of automation and technology and so on, perhaps as a replacement for other sort of clunkier forms of benefit. If you could get rid of a whole myriad of different types of welfare benefit, replace it simply with a single payment from the government. But as I say, the problem you keep coming back to is it has to be set at such a high level to achieve those effects. It actually becomes extremely, extremely expensive. I've got a comment on the GDP question as well, actually, that came up. This is really interesting. There's been a lot of debate in the UK and elsewhere recently about whether GDP is a good measure of economic activity, let alone broader issues like happiness and well-being and so on. But there is a lot of work being done on making sure that activities that traditionally haven't been counted in GDP are now excluded. As it happens, by the way, that includes large elements of the shadow economy, like illegal drugs and other things. But in particular, about unpaid work, they are now looking at including that. So they work out some way of saying that if somebody is doing unpaid work, then you cost that in GDP by working out what it would cost that family or person to pay somebody else to do it. I think that's very important to do because it recognizes the work that people do, typically women, of course, in these unpaid roles. But there is a caveat there, precisely because this work is unpaid. Including it in GDP might give a misleading impression of the ability of the economy to pay taxes, to finance debt and so on, and therefore sort of pay for the public services on which we depend. So it depends what you're using GDP as. A measure of overall economic activity, yes, include unpaid work. If you're using it as a measure of the ability of the economy to pay for other things, then you have to be careful.
A couple more questions. Can we bring, is there a microphone? Yeah, yeah. Blonde lady here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I have to say when I heard this talk come up for last 2 years because of the intense schedule I had in corporate America, I'm suffering from adrenal system fatigue right now. So my whole experience has been corporate America for the past 10 years, being involved in corporate change, cultural change at a Fortune 500 company. And standing back and listening to everything you say, the one thing that really bothers me when companies who are 20 to 30,000 people who want to change, the leadership talks, doesn't trickle down. And the one thing I consistently thought is basically shareholders, publicly traded companies. Alex, you mentioned companies like startups in Silicon Valley. They're small. You have that nimbleness. But when you're a legacy brand to try switch and change, but yet they still tout themselves as these balanced companies, Is it basically going down to having capitalism, as Mark Benioff saying, having to change? I'm just curious to see your input, because it's the shareholders, I feel, is the one thing that holds up a lot of this cultural change that you're discussing.
Sure. I don't have companies that have shareholders. I do have ones that have some, sort of big VC investors. And I was surprised that sort of VCs, people who generally encourage startups to work themselves to death so that they can afford, another yacht at Cabo, actually are much more affirmative about this than I would have expected. I think, as for internally, what we've seen with big companies historically moving, let's say, from 6-day weeks to 5-day weeks, the way that Ford Motor Company did in the 1920s, was it gets rolled out division by division. So it took them 3 years of experiments throughout the company before they finally implemented it on the factory line, the really famous example. There are a couple, there are a couple places in Korea, a couple chaebols, who have little experiments going with 4-day weeks in a couple of their smaller groups, partly with an eye to seeing, can we roll it out elsewhere? I think the shareholder question, it really comes down, I think, to this. The 4-day week offers benefits in recruitment and retention, higher profitability, higher quality of life, work-life balance and quality of life, and better professional and talent development. Which one of those do you object to? And if you can explain that as a shareholder, as an investor, then we can begin to have a conversation about, why you resist.
If I may, I want to also add Julian's point here, which this is about changing cultures and behaviors, and unless you're really doing that diligently at every level, you will not unleash the additional benefits. And companies can do this. I'll name one, Diageo. Diageo actually is one of the most gender-balanced companies in the UK. It's also one of the most productive companies in the UK. The CEO and leadership team have relentlessly cascaded a culture of inclusivity, of acceptance, of flexibility into their processes, into their culture, so that those things that you were mentioning don't happen, and they're reaping the rewards. So you have to have ambition plus action at every level, and then you can deliver this. But it's not easy. It's hard work, and that's where it falls down.
So I think we have the result of oh, what a surprise. Well, actually, you weren't far off. You said you were going to lose 9-1, and it was 8.7. So 87% are for. What a good economic predictor. 87% are for the shorter working week, and 13% are against, and that's based on. It's only 91 votes. So there's millions of other people out there you can persuade. But that is unsurprising. So we have to wrap up now, I'm afraid, because we're out of time. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for your questions. If you want to know more about the RSA, you can sign up via the website and receive project newsletters and so on. And downstairs in the cafe, there are people who can talk to you about getting involved in RSA projects. You can also buy Shorter in the foyer if you want to hear more on that. And I think some copies have been signed. And for now, join me in thanking our guest speakers, Alex, Anne, and Julian. Thank you very much.